The key went in halfway, then stopped. Loretta Haynes stood on the porch of the house she had lived in for 33 years, holding a key that no longer fit the lock she had used 10,000 times. Behind the door, the lights were on. She could hear footsteps crossing the living room floor. Slow, deliberate. The particular sound of a man who knew she was standing there and had decided not to hurry. She pulled the key out, tried again. Nothing. Across the street, a curtain moved in the Delhaney's front window. They'd lived there 9 years. Loretta had delivered their mail for 7 of those. She knew their names, their kids' names, the return address on the cards they sent to a son stationed in Georgia. Nobody came out. Loretta did not look at the curtain. She looked at the door. She had walked through that door, carrying groceries, carrying grief, carrying 33 years of a life she had built around a man who had just changed the lock while she was at the store buying milk. The suitcase was behind her, her old one from the back of the bedroom closet standing upright on the porch like it had been waiting for her. He had packed it himself. That was the part that would stay with her longest, not the lock, not the lawyers, not what came after. The careful way he had packed it. Like a man who wanted credit for being decent while doing the most indecent thing he had ever done. The key went in halfway, then stopped. Loretta Haynes stood on the porch of the house she had lived in for 33 years, holding a key that no longer fit the lock she had used 10,000 times. Behind the door, the lights were on. She could hear footsteps crossing the living room floor. Slow, deliberate. The particular sound of a man who knew she was standing there and had decided not to hurry. She pulled the key out. Tried again. Nothing. Across the street, a curtain moved in the Delhaney's front window. They'd lived there 9 years. Loretta had delivered their mail for 7 of those. She knew their names, their kids' names, the return address on the cards they sent to a son stationed in Georgia. Nobody came out. Loretta did not look at the curtain. She looked at the door. She had walked through that door carrying groceries, carrying grief, carrying 33 years of a life she had built around a man who had just changed the lock while she was out buying milk. A gallon of 2% a small can of tomato soup she had almost put back because Douglas tracked receipts. That was the kind of marriage it had been for a long time now. The kind where a woman thought twice about a can of soup. The suitcase was behind her, her old one from the back of the bedroom closet standing upright on the porch like it had been waiting. Beside it, 2 trash bags tied at the top, the shape of her brown winter coat, pressing against the plastic from the inside. He had packed it himself. She could tell by the way the handles sat. Douglas folded things the way he did everything else correctly, efficiently, in a way that made it hard to complain about the result, even when everything about the process was wrong. She knocked once, not because she thought he would open it, because 33 years of walking through a door without knocking made standing on the outside of it feel like something that needed to be acknowledged. Footsteps crossed the living room again. Then the door opened 2 inches. Douglas kept his hand on the frame. He was wearing the gray sweater she had given him for Christmas 4 years ago. She remembered standing in the department store holding it up, thinking the color would suit him. Loretta. He said her full name the way he always did when he wanted to sound reasonable. The lawyers will be in touch. He paused. Don't make this into something it doesn't need to be. He closed the door. She heard the deadbolt turn. Across the street, the curtain in the Del Haney window had gone still. Loretta did not look at it. She crouched down on the porch and unzipped the suitcase. Her clothes were folded the way Douglas folded things. 2 sweaters, 3 blouses, her winter nightgown. Her medication in the front pocket, the small orange bottles lined up neatly, her name on every label. He had remembered her heart medication. He had packed it carefully, thoughtfully, the same way he had changed the lock and set her suitcase on the porch and told her the lawyers would be in touch. Carefully enough to call himself decent, she moved the clothes aside. At the bottom, wrapped loosely in a page from a newspaper, was a small wooden box she hadn't seen in more than 12 years. Her father's. Walter Haynes had kept it on the shelf above his workbench, and she used to stand on a step stool to reach it when she was small. The wood was cedar-worn smooth at the corners from years of the same hands touching it in the same places. The cedar smell came through even now, even after all this time, cutting through the cold October air, like something that had been saving itself for this exact moment. Douglas had packed her father's box himself, which meant he had held it, which meant he had seen it sitting in the drawer at the bottom of the bedroom closet. And he had decided it was nothing, an old keepsake, a piece of junk not worth leaving behind. And he had put it in the suitcase without opening it, without asking what was inside. That was important. She didn't know why yet, but she filed it away in the particular part of her mind she had used for 31 years as a mail carrier. The part that noticed things without immediately knowing what they meant, that held information patiently until the right moment arrived. She stood up, put the box under her arm, lifted the suitcase with her other hand, and walked to the car without looking back at the door. The motel on Route 9 smelled like cigarette smoke and industrial cleaning fluid, and the heating unit under the window made a sound like it was apologizing for not working better. Loretta sat on the edge of the bed. Not the middle, the edge. The way you sat when you weren't sure you were staying. The suitcase stood against the wall. The 2 trash bags were on the floor beside it. Her brown coat was draped over the chair in the corner because there was nowhere else to put it, and she wasn't ready to use the closet. Using the closet felt like something you did when you had decided to be somewhere for a while. 3 messages on her phone from Cade Fenn, Douglas's son, 39 years old, sold real estate on the south side of Harlan. She had known him since he was 6 years old. She had signed his birthday cards, Mom L, for 20 years because he'd asked her to, and she hadn't known how to say that it felt like something that needed to be earned first before it could be given so freely. She did not open the messages. Outside, trucks downshifted on Route 9, then another, then another. She had delivered mail to 3 businesses along this stretch of road for 11 years before her route changed. She knew the name of the woman who ran the diner 2 miles east. She knew which mechanic's shop got parts catalogs on Tuesdays. 31 years. Every house, every mailbox, every name on every envelope in Pike County. Tonight, not one person in Harlan knew which room Loretta Haynes was sleeping in. She sat with that for a moment. Then she reached for the wooden box. The cedar smell came through stronger when she turned it over, checking the latch the way her father had shown her when she was 12. Press here first, then lift. It sticks if you just pull. She pressed. She lifted. The latch gave. Inside a piece of paper folded into quarters. And underneath it, an iron key. The key was heavier than it looked. Old style, the kind with a long shaft and a wide bow at the top, the teeth gone rough with rust at the tips. She held it in her palm and looked at it the way you looked at something you recognized but couldn't quite place. Like a word you knew the meaning of but hadn't said out loud in years. She set the key on the nightstand and unfolded the paper. Her father's handwriting. Block letters pressed hard the way he always wrote, like he wanted the words to stay. Haynes Ridge Road, off County 14, Pike County, blue mailbox, no name on it. Key fits the front door. And below that, underlined, twice the ink slightly darker, where the pen had gone over it a second time. Don't let anybody tell you this is nothing. She read it once. Then she folded it back along the same creases and set it on top of the key. The trucks on Route 9 kept going. The heater ticked. Loretta did not cry. She sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like other people's years and looked at a folded piece of paper and an iron key that her father had left for her and that Douglas had packed into her suitcase without ever wondering what was inside. She thought about Douglas saying those words, the words he had said exactly twice in 33 years of marriage whenever the subject of her father's land came up. Nothing out there worth the drive. He had said it the first time at a family dinner, when a distant cousin asked about the Haynes property after Walter died. The second time when Loretta herself had mentioned it years later, wondering aloud if she should go see what condition the place was in. Both times Douglas had said the same thing. Flat. Certain. The way he said things he had already decided and didn't want revisited. Nothing out there worth the drive. She had heard it like a fact. That was the kind of marriage it had been. The kind where a man said something with enough certainty that a woman stopped wondering if he might be wrong. She turned the key over in her hand. The iron was cold, then not cold. At 4 a.m, she was still awake. She placed the key on the nightstand where the light from the parking lot came through the gap in the curtains and landed on it in a thin stripe. She watched the stripe move across the key as the night shifted slow and steady. The way time moved when there was nowhere to be and nothing left to protect. When the sky outside went from black to the particular gray that came just before dawn, Loretta got up, put on her coat, and slid the key into the front pocket. She did not check her phone. She did not look at the trash bags. She picked up her car keys and went out into the cold. Haynes Ridge Road did not appear on her phone's GPS. She found it the way her father had taught her to find things, by watching for what the map left out, by reading the land instead of the screen. She had been driving for 40 minutes when the county route narrowed, then narrowed again, and she began looking for a mailbox the color of an old sky. She almost passed it. The blue had faded to something closer to gray, and the box itself leaned into the drainage ditch at the road's edge, like it had given up on standing straight sometime in the previous decade. But the numbers on the side matched the address on the paper in her father's handwriting, and she pulled over and checked twice before she believed it. The lane in was 2 tire tracks with grass growing up the middle. Branches scraped the roof of her car on both sides. She drove slow first gear, the way you drove when you weren't sure what you would find at the end. What she found was worse than she expected, and better than she had any right to hope for. The cabin sat back from the lane in a clearing that had gone mostly to weeds. The roof sagged in the middle like a spine that had held too much for too long. The porch steps, 2 of them, had gone soft and dark with rot. A young oak had grown up flush against the left window, its branches pressing the glass from the outside with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time, and had decided waiting was no problem at all. Knee-high grass ran all the way to the door. Douglas had called this nothing for 33 years. Loretta sat in the car and looked at it through the windshield. Then she got out. The iron key went into the lock hard and caught. She pressed, turned, pressed again. For a moment, she thought it wasn't going to work, that the lock had rusted through, or swollen shut, or simply decided, after 12 years of waiting, that it wasn't going to open for anyone. Then it gave. The door swung inward with a sound like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time and had finally decided it could stop. Cold air and damp wood met her at the threshold. And underneath both of those, something else, something she felt in her chest before she could name it. Motor oil, old flannel, the specific smell of a man's work coat hung in the same place for years. Her father had smelled like that when she was small. She hadn't smelled it in 20 years. She stood in the doorway and let it come to her. The floor creaked once under her right foot. From somewhere inside the walls, a small animal moved and went still, startled by the intrusion of light and air, and a human presence in a space that hadn't held one for a long time. Loretta waited. The animal did not move again. She went in. The front room held a pine table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the corner, with a dented pipe running up through the ceiling. A shelf on the far wall, empty, except for 3 rusted tin cans lined up at one end, like sentinels, that had long since stopped expecting anyone to come. The floorboards were wide-cut oak gray with age, the gaps between them packed with 40 years of dust and shadow. A clock on the wall above the table had stopped at 9:14. She didn't know if it had been morning or night when the hands had last moved, or what year that had been. It didn't matter. Time in this cabin had been keeping its own count for a long time, and it didn't need her to agree with it. Then she saw the wall beside the door. A set of iron hooks, 4 of them driven into the wood at shoulder height. On the first hook, an orange hunting vest stiff with age. The blaze color faded at the shoulders from seasons of sunlight coming through a window that no longer existed in the same condition it had when the vest was new. On the second hook, a wool jacket, the color of dried leaves, heavy and shapeless, the kind of jacket a man wore because it worked, and not because it looked like anything in particular. And on the third hook, sharing the same nail with the wool jacket, a canvas work cap, blue. The brim curved forward in a shape that didn't come from the factory. It came from 40 years of the same hand reaching for the same cap, in the same motion, pulling it on, in the same way, the brim curving gradually, imperceptibly, season by season, until it fit exactly one head and no other. Loretta knew that cap. She had watched it disappear into tree lines every fall from the time she was small enough to press her face against the kitchen window. She had watched it come back at dusk, her father's breath making clouds in the cold air, the cap still on his head as he came across the yard. She had watched him hang it on a nail by whatever door he came through. Always the same nail, always the same motion. He hadn't taken the hunting gear off the wall, which meant he had always meant to come back, which meant he had thought she would come too eventually. That someday, some way, some morning, when she needed it most, she would find her way down County 14 and up the gravel lane to a door with a lock that an old iron key could still open. Loretta did not take the cap down. She left it where it was. She found a broom in the corner of the kitchen, cracked handle bristles worn down on one side from years of use. The kind of broom that had been in the same corner so long, it had practically become part of the architecture. She took it and began to sweep, not because she had a plan, not because she had decided to stay or to go or to do anything in particular with a sagging roofed cabin in the middle of a Pike County field that her husband had dismissed for 33 years without ever bothering to see it with his own eyes. She swept because the floor needed sweeping, and she was the only one there to do it. Dust rose in the thin October light that came through the dirty window. Dead leaves scraped across the floorboards. The broom moved in long strokes, corner to corner, the way her mother had taught her when she was young enough to be taught things like that. Don't push the dirt, her mother used to say. Pull it toward you. She was pulling a pile of grit toward the kitchen doorway when the broom head caught. Not on the baseboard, on the floor itself, on a board that sat slightly higher than the ones around it, maybe half an inch, maybe less. but enough. The edge of it just enough to catch a broom on. Loretta stopped. She looked down. She pressed the board with her foot. It moved. Not the way a warped board moved under pressure, shifting and then settling back into place. It moved deliberately, purposefully, like a lid, like something that had been designed to open rather than to hold still. She stood there a moment with the broom still in her hand. 31 years of delivering other people's mail had taught her many things. It had taught her that the weight of an envelope told you almost as much as the name on the front. It had taught her that people who moved often got different kinds of mail than people who stayed. It had taught her that return addresses changed, that handwriting aged, that some houses got birthday cards every year from the same address for decades, and some houses never got birthday cards at all. And it had taught her above almost everything else what it looked like when something had been put somewhere on purpose. She set the broom against the wall. In the kitchen drawer, she found a butter knife. Old, the handle worn smooth from years of someone's grip, the blade rounded at the tip. Not much of a tool, enough of one. She worked the blade into the seam at the edge of the board, pressed down on the handle, and felt the board begin to give. It came up on the second try, lifting with a sound like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time, deciding finally that it would open now. Underneath was a shallow space, maybe 8 inches deep, the dirt floor below it lined with a piece of burlap folded into quarters. And on top of the burlap, sitting level and deliberate in the darkness, was a tin box, rectangular, the size of a shoebox cut in half. The lid rusted at the seams in a way that spoke of many winters, many thaws, many seasons of cold and damp, working on the metal while the cabin stood empty above it. Loretta lifted the box out with both hands and set it on the pine table. She looked at the clock on the wall. 9:14. Still. She worked the lid loose with the butter knife, set it aside. Inside, a manila envelope thick, its edges gone the color of old tea. Wrapped around it, 2 loops of electrical tape, the black kind, wide the way her father wrapped things. He wanted to stay dry through whatever came. She had watched him wrap her grandmother's photograph albums the same way every winter, setting them on the highest shelf in the mud room against the possibility that the creek might come up. She peeled the tape off in strips. Slow, the way it wanted to come. The envelope opened without tearing. Inside, a small stack of papers clipped together at the top left corner with a binder clip gone orange with rust. She took them out and laid them on the table one at a time. The first page was a mineral rights registration filed with Pike County in 1989. The name on the filing in her father's careful block letters, on the signature line, Walter B. Haynes. The second page was dated 2003. A transfer of mineral rights notarized by a woman named Agnes Purdy at a notary office in Pikeville, 2 witness signatures she didn't recognize. And on the designated line, the line that said who the rights were being transferred to a name typed clean and certain Loretta Ann Haynes. She read it once. Then she put her finger under each word and read it again. Not wife of, not Mrs. Douglas Fenn. Not the name that had appeared on the joint checking account before Douglas had her name removed from it 3 weeks ago, which she had discovered only when she went to buy groceries and her card was declined. Loretta Ann Haynes. Her name, the one her father had given her, standing on its own on a legal document in a county filing in a tin box under the floorboards of a cabin that Douglas Fenn had spent 33 years calling nothing. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass in the clearing, flattening it and letting it rise again. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line and went quiet. Then she set the transfer page aside and looked at what else was in the envelope. 3 smaller envelopes sealed, never opened. She could tell by the gum on the flaps still intact, still holding. The return address on all 3 was the same Appalachian Basin Energy Company, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Each one addressed to L. Haynes Ridge Road, Pike County, Kentucky. Each one stamped in red on the front, return to sender. No recipient on file. She knew that stamp. She had pressed it herself hundreds of times over the course of her career. She had loaded it with fresh ink, pressed it onto envelopes, sorted those envelopes into the return bin at the end of her shift. She knew exactly what it meant, and more importantly, what it didn't mean. It didn't mean the address was wrong. It meant nobody had registered to receive mail at that address. It meant the postal system had no record of anyone living there. It also meant that someone could have filed a mail forwarding request and hadn't. Someone could have updated the delivery record at the county post office and hadn't. In 31 years of postal work, Loretta had learned that return to sender was rarely about a wrong address. It was almost always about a decision someone had made or not made about who was allowed to receive what. She opened the most recent envelope first. 2021. Inside a letter on company letterhead from Appalachian Basin Energy Company. A formal request to discuss a lease arrangement for the mineral rights beneath the property at Haynes Ridge Road. An advance payment figure. Monthly royalty terms laid out in plain language. And at the bottom, handwritten in the margin in blue ink, 3rd attempt. If no response received within 90 days, file will be transferred to uncontested status. She looked at the date on the letter. Then she looked at it again. The letter had been sent 8 months before Douglas Fenn sat down at the kitchen table on Chestnut Drive on a Tuesday morning and told her in his most reasonable voice that he thought it was time they went their separate ways. She set it down. She picked up the 2020 envelope, then the 2019 envelope. She laid all 3 in a row on the pine table, oldest to newest, left to right, the way she had always sorted undeliverable mail at the end of a shift, so the story ran in the right direction, so you could see the shape of it. 3 letters, 3 years. A company in Pittsburgh trying to reach the woman whose name was on the mineral rights beneath this land. 3 years of letters going out and coming back, return to sender. No recipient on file, while the clock on the wall stood at 9:14, and the tin box waited under the floorboard, and the cabin stood empty in the middle of a field that Douglas Fenn had spent 33 years calling nothing. He hadn't left her because the marriage was over.
He had left her because the window was closing. Loretta sat at the pine table in the cold cabin with her father's papers spread out before her, and the iron key in her coat pocket, and a clock on the wall that had stopped at 9:14 and would not tell her what time it was now. She didn't need it to. She already knew what time it was. It was time to find out exactly what her father had left her, and exactly how long Douglas Finn had known about it. The Pike County clerk's office smelled like copy paper and old carpet, and Loretta Haynes had been inside it exactly once before 30 years ago, when she and Douglas had filed the deed on the house on Chestnut Drive. She remembered Douglas doing most of the talking that day. She remembered signing where he pointed. She got there at 8:47. The doors didn't open until 9. She stood on the sidewalk outside with the manila envelope in a canvas grocery bag and watched a pigeon work at something on the front steps. A man in a brown jacket came around the corner, glanced at her, kept walking. She was used to that. 31 years of standing at doors, post office doors, screen doors. The occasional locked gate had taught her how to occupy a piece of sidewalk without making anyone uncomfortable about it. She had learned early that a woman standing still in a public place was either waiting for something or in someone's way, and the difference between those two things had everything to do with how she held herself. She held herself like a woman who was waiting because she was. At 9 o'clock, a young man in a blue lanyard unlocked the front door from the inside. Loretta was the first one in. The clerk at the front counter had a name tag that said Marcus. He looked about 24. She put the papers in front of him and explained what she had mineral rights transfer, notarized 2003. Her name on the designation line, and watched his face do the thing faces did when they were reading something they mostly understood but weren't entirely sure what to do with. "I'll need to check with someone," he said. "Can you take a seat?" She sat in a plastic chair next to the water cooler and waited 17 minutes. She knew it was 17 because she watched the clock on the wall above the service window. The kind with a second hand that moved in small jerks rather than a smooth sweep, each tick a small separate decision rather than one continuous motion. A door opened behind the counter. The woman who came out was around 58, maybe 60. Silver hair cut short and neat. Reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She moved like someone who had been doing this job long enough that nothing surprised her anymore. Not the papers people brought in, not the stories those papers represented, not the particular look on a person's face when they were holding something important and weren't yet sure if the world was going to treat it that way. She looked at Loretta's documents without picking them up first, just leaned over the counter, reading from the top. Then she came around to the public side of the counter and sat down in the plastic chair across from Loretta. Not behind the counter, across from her. "I'm Evelyn Cross," she said. "Let me take a look at these properly." She read slowly, both pages. When she got to the 2003 transfer, she stopped. not at the legal language which she clearly knew well enough to read the way most people read a menu. She stopped at the property address, Haynes Ridge Road. She read it a second time. Something moved across her expression, a small recognition, a flicker of something that could have been surprise, or could have been the opposite of surprise. And then it settled back, and she continued reading. Loretta watched her and held the canvas bag in her lap with both hands. "This transfer is clean," Evelyn said. She set the page down on the arm of the chair between them. "Notarized, witnessed, filed correctly. These mineral rights were never part of your marital estate. They came to you by designation from your father before your marriage was registered, and they were never retitled jointly." She looked up. "That means they aren't subject to division in your divorce proceedings." Loretta did not say anything. Evelyn's voice stayed even and unhurried, the way the voices of people who worked with difficult information for a living tended to stay not cold, not distant, but measured. Like she understood that some things needed to be said at a pace that allowed a person to actually hear them. "If a company has been attempting to contact you regarding a lease on these rights," Evelyn continued, "you have the authority to negotiate that independently. No other signature is required." She tapped the transfer page once with one finger. "That name there, that's yours. It stands on its own. It always has." Loretta's hands tightened slightly on the canvas bag. "You need to speak with an attorney before you do anything else," Evelyn said. "Don't sign anything. Not for the energy company. Not for anyone connected to your ex-husband. Not for anyone who presents themselves as trying to help you simplify the situation." She said that last part, simplify the situation, with a small pause, before simplify the way you paused, before a word you had heard used wrong too many times, and wanted to mark the distance between the word and what it usually meant when people like that used it. Loretta gathered her papers and put them back in the envelope. She stood up. "Thank you," she said. Evelyn nodded. Then, just as Loretta turned toward the door, she spoke again. "Your husband, ex-husband, he hasn't been in contact with our office recently, has he?" Loretta turned back. "Not that I know of." Evelyn nodded again. She did not explain. She did not add anything. She folded her hands together on her knee in a way that closed the conversation as cleanly as a door pulled shut. Outside, Loretta walked to her car and stood beside it for a moment before getting in. The parking lot was half full. A woman was loading a stroller into a minivan 2 rows over, working quickly against the cold, the kind of focused efficiency that came from doing the same thing many times. The October sky above Pikeville was the color of old pewter flat, and without texture, the kind of sky that had decided on its mood for the day and was not going to revisit the decision. Evelyn Cross had been kind. She had been helpful. She had told Loretta not to sign anything and had explained why in language that treated her like an adult who deserved to understand her own situation. And then, right at the end, when Loretta was already standing, already turning toward the door, Evelyn had asked about Douglas. Loretta hadn't thought much of it at the time. She thought about it now. She drove back toward Haynes Ridge Road and thought about it for 40 minutes. The cabin was cold when she returned. The way buildings that haven't held heat in a long time were cold, not just in temperature, but in character, as if the cold had settled into the wood itself and made itself at home over 12 years of unoccupied winters. She had bought a bag of firewood at a gas station on Route 9 the day before. She brought it in now and spent the better part of an hour learning the wood stove. The flue damper was stiff. The wood was slightly damp from sitting in the bed of someone's truck before she'd bought it. The newspaper she used for kindling was the Harlan Daily Enterprise, 2 weeks old, and she read 3 paragraphs of a story about a zoning dispute near Benham while she waited to see if the fire would catch. It didn't the first time. It did the second. She sat at the pine table with the fire going, and a cup of instant coffee she'd made on the single gas burner she'd found under the kitchen counter, and she laid all the papers out in front of her again. The mineral rights registration, the 2003 transfer, the 3 envelopes from Appalachian Basin Energy 2019, 2020, 2021, all stamped return to sender, all addressed to L. Haynes at an address where nobody, as far as the postal system was concerned, had ever lived. She was looking at the 3rd envelope, the 2021 one, the one with the handwritten note about uncontested status when she heard the car. Tires on gravel. Slow and deliberate the way people drove when they wanted to seem like they weren't in a hurry, but were very much in a hurry about something. She got up and went to the window and looked through the gap in the curtain. A silver SUV came up the lane, branches brushing both sides, moving at the pace of a vehicle whose driver was trying not to look like he'd made a specific effort to find this place. It parked in the clearing in front of the cabin, and the door opened, and Cade Finn got out. 39 years old, Douglas's son from his first marriage. He had Douglas's jaw and Douglas's way of standing weight, slightly back chin, slightly up the posture of a man who had learned early that rooms tended to accommodate him. He was carrying 2 paper cups with green logos on the sides. Starbucks. The nearest one was 45 minutes down Route 7 toward Harlan. He had dressed for a real estate showing, not a gravel road in Pike County. Polo shirt the color of a swimming pool. Shoes that had never seen unpaved ground before today. He looked at the cabin the way a person looked at a property listing that had not photographed well and was performing even worse in person. Mom L. He smiled and held out one of the cups. I've been trying to reach you. She took the coffee. She did not say she knew. They sat on the porch steps, the ones that held, not the 2 that didn't, and Cade asked if she was warm enough, if she had what she needed, if she'd eaten. He said Douglas was worried. He himself was worried. 33 years was a long time, and the way things had ended wasn't right. He said that too in the tone people used when they wanted to receive credit for acknowledging something without doing anything about it. Loretta drank her coffee and listened. She had spent 31 years reading the mail before she put it in the box. Not the contents, she had never been that kind of carrier, but the shape of it. Who was sending? Who was receiving? How often? Whether the return address on a particular envelope had changed over the past year or stayed the same. Whether a household that used to receive 3 pieces of mail a week had dropped to 1. You learned things without meaning to. You learned that people who arrived with their hands full were almost always there for something their hands couldn't hold.
Dad mentioned there might be some old paperwork out here,
Cade said. He said it the way you said something you had been constructing the approach to for most of the drive-in. Nothing complicated. Just that old rural properties can sometimes have loose ends, title issues, things that get overlooked. He wanted to make sure nobody was taking advantage of the situation. Loretta looked at him, at the careful way he was sitting, leaning slightly forward, elbows on knees, the posture of a man who had been told to seem relaxed. She thought about the phrase taking advantage of the situation. She thought about who exactly that phrase was meant to be protecting her from. "How did your father know I was here?" she asked. "He worries," Cade said. "You know how he is." She did know how he was. "If there are any documents related to the property," Cade continued, "it might just be easier if Dad's attorney took a look, just to make sure everything's clear." His voice was warm, practiced. The smile that accompanied it was Douglas's smile 30 years younger and considerably smoother. "I'll handle my own paperwork," Loretta said. Cade nodded slowly, like that was a reasonable position and he was giving it every consideration it deserved. He finished his coffee, said to call if she needed anything, and wrote his number on the lid of the paper cup with a marker he produced from his shirt pocket. He added call anytime. Mom L, in neat block letters, set the lid on the porch rail beside her and walked back to the SUV. She watched him back down the lane until the tree line took him. Then she picked up the cup lid and turned it over. On the underside, printed in small text, around the edge of a logo she'd almost missed, Fenn and Dornan Property Group, Harlan, Kentucky. The lettering ran in a curve beneath a small outline of a house. She recognized the building. She had delivered mail to it for 9 years. It was the same building that housed the offices of Garrett Blevins' attorney at law, Douglas Fenn's attorney, for the last 12 years. Loretta did not throw the cup away. She carried it inside and set it carefully in the paper bag she'd been using for trash, setting it upright, lid facing up. The way she used to set aside mail that had been opened and resealed somewhere between the sender and her route. That kind of mail always meant someone had wanted to know what was inside before it reached the person it was addressed to. She went back to the pine table and sat down. She wrote Cade's visit at the bottom of the page she'd been keeping date time, what he'd said, what he hadn't said, the cup lid, and what was printed on it. She wrote it the way she would have written up an irregularity report at the post office. Just the facts, just the sequence, nothing she couldn't verify. Then she sat back and looked at the clock on the wall. 9:14. Still. She was at the table 2 evenings later, writing in the same careful sequence what happened, when it happened, what was said when the headlights swept across the kitchen wall. Slow, deliberate. She went to the window. Douglas's truck was parked at the end of the lane, nose toward the cabin. He was still inside it. She could see the shape of him in the driver's seat, the particular stillness of a man deciding how to walk into a room before he walked into it. She had watched him do that before every difficult conversation in 33 years of marriage. The pause in the hallway, the hand on the door frame, the breath taken where she couldn't see it.
He sat there 4 minutes. She counted. Then he got out. He knocked the way he always knocked when he wanted to seem reasonable, 3 times evenly spaced, not too hard. The knock of a man who had never needed to bang on anything in his life, because doors had generally opened for him before he finished deciding to knock. Loretta opened the door, but did not step aside.
Douglas. He was wearing his good coat, the dark wool one he wore when he wanted to look like a man who had arrived to handle something, not to fight about it. His expression was the one she had seen in every difficult conversation going back to the early years of their marriage, the one that said, "I am being very patient with a complicated situation."
"I've been worried about you,"
he said.
"This place isn't safe. No reliable heat. The roof has been compromised for years. You're out here by yourself and nobody knows where you are."
"I know where I am," she said. He nodded as if that were a reasonable contribution to the conversation, and he was incorporating it thoughtfully. His eyes went past her shoulder into the cabin. One quick look, the kind that counted things, how many papers on the table, whether anyone else was present, what the layout of the room would allow. He had always been fast with spaces. It was part of what had made him good at real estate for 30 years. He put it together in about 2 seconds and looked back at her face.
"My attorney could come out," he said. "Take a look at whatever your father left out here, just to make sure nothing gets complicated.
Just so nobody takes advantage of the situation." There it was again. The same phrase Cade had used. Word for word, the same phrase. She had delivered mail to enough households over enough years to know what it meant when a family used the same language. It meant someone had written the script and handed it down. "I have my own attorney," she said. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter and more calculated than anger. Recalculation. The adjustment of a man who had expected a different response and was rapidly revising his approach. "Lou." His voice dropped half a register. The one he used when he wanted to sound like he was letting her in on something.
"Come on. You don't need to make this harder than it has to be. I'm not the enemy here. I'm trying to help you." He put his hand on the doorframe then, not stepping in, just placing his hand there, fingers resting on the wood thumb against the outer edge. The gesture of a man asserting ownership over something without technically claiming it. The way you put a hand on a fence rail to remind both people whose fence it was. Loretta looked at his hand. Then she looked at the lock plate on the door. The new one. Brass. Still bright at the edges where the screwdriver had slipped during installation. She had bought it at the hardware store in Pikeville 4 days ago and put it in herself with a tutorial she'd watched twice on her phone in the motel parking lot before she drove out here. Douglas's eyes moved to the lock.
She watched him understand it. Not just that the lock was new, he could see that, but what it meant that the lock was new, that she had changed it before he arrived, which meant she had known he would come, which meant she had been thinking about this longer and more clearly than he had assumed she was capable of thinking about it. "This isn't Chestnut Drive," she said. "You don't have a key to this lock." He took his hand off the frame. The careful expression held for another moment. Then something shifted underneath it, something that was not quite anger and not quite anything. She had a clean word for the expression of a man who had built his life on being 3 steps ahead and had just discovered that someone he had underestimated had been running a different course entirely. "You're going to make things very complicated for yourself," he said. Quiet, almost gentle. The way people said things they wanted to register as warnings rather than threats, so that later, if asked, they could say they had only been trying to help. Loretta began to close the door. Douglas stood on the porch until the door was nearly shut. Then she heard him step back. Gravel under his boots. The sound of a man regrouping. The truck door. The engine turning over. She stood at the closed door and listened to him back down the lane, and when the engine sound had faded enough, she went to the window and watched anyway, because she had learned over 31 years of paying attention to things other people considered beneath their notice, that the moment a person stopped looking was often the moment something important happened. He stopped at the end of Haynes Ridge Road, not pulling out onto the county route. Stopped. And in the dark, the small blue light of a phone screen lit up the inside of the cab. He was already calling someone before he had even left the property. 22 minutes later, her phone buzzed on the table. "Cade, just checking in, Mom L. Let me know if you need anything." She set the phone face down. Then she pressed both hands flat on top of the wood stove, which was still warm from the afternoon fire. She stood there for a moment with her palms against the metal, feeling the heat come through. She had known he would come. She had changed the lock because she knew. She had kept her voice level and her hands still through the whole of it. But her hands were shaking now in the quiet, after in the way that things that had been held very tightly tended to shake when you finally let them. She let them shake for a moment. Then she went back to the table. Bertie Soult was parked on the road shoulder in a pickup that had seen considerably better years. Driver's door open, one boot on the running board, a spiral notebook open against her forearm. She was writing in it with a pen, not looking at a phone, not dictating into anything, just writing the old way, the way people wrote when they intended to keep what they were putting down. 55, maybe a few years past it. Flannel shirt the color of a winter sky. Hair gone salt and pepper pulled back without much attention paid to how it looked. The kind of woman who had stopped spending time on appearances somewhere around the same time she had stopped having time to spend. Loretta almost didn't stop. In 31 years of mail delivery, she had learned that strangers near your mailbox usually wanted something, and it was rarely something straightforward. But the notebook caught her attention. People who used paper notebooks in the age of voice memos were either old enough to be set in their ways or committed enough to their work that they didn't care what the alternative was. Bertie Sult, it turned out, was the latter. Loretta pulled up and got out.
"You're on private property,"
she said. "Not unfriendly, just clear." The woman looked up from the notebook. "I know, I'm sorry." I was about to knock. She closed the notebook. "My name is Bertie Sult. I write for the Pike County Courier." She said it the way people said things they expected to be questioned about.
"I've been working on a piece about mineral rights," she continued, "specifically about women in eastern Kentucky who've lost them or come close to losing them during divorce proceedings without fully understanding what they were signing." She paused. 3 addresses in the county records have been flagged as properties with no established contact for the rights holder. This address is one of them. She had pulled a small card from the breast pocket of her flannel shirt and was holding it out. Loretta took it. Plain card. Name, publication, phone number. No title, no decorative border. The kind of card a person printed because they needed one, not because they wanted to impress anyone with it. "I spoke with a woman named Carol Webb at the post office on Maple Street," Bertie said. "She told me you worked the rural routes out this way for a long time. She said if anyone would know what to do with a piece of land that had been overlooked for years, it was probably you." Loretta looked at the card. "What do you want?" she asked. "A conversation." Bertie didn't hesitate. "And if you have documents, I'd like to see them." "What does that give me?" Bertie looked at her directly. "Attention is the one thing that people like Douglas Fenn can't control once it exists. A story in print changes what a person can do quietly. It doesn't fix everything, but it makes quiet considerably harder." She said his name without hesitation, without searching for it, which meant she had already done her research and had arrived at this mailbox knowing whose property it was and whose name was on the mineral rights and what the timeline of that story looked like from the outside. "How did you find the other addresses?" Loretta asked. "One of them found me." Bertie turned a page in her notebook, not reading it, just something to do with her hands. "The other I found through deed records in Letcher County. Both women had signed release agreements they didn't fully understand. Both received considerably less than fair market value for rights that were worth significantly more. And in both cases, a name appears in the paperwork that isn't Douglas Fenn's name, but is connected to him." She looked up. "I'm not ready to put that name in print yet. I need more than I currently have." Loretta stood with her hand on the mailbox door. The metal was cold. October had finally committed to what it was going to be. "How many women?" she asked. Bertie looked down at her notebook, then back up. "2 confirmed. I think there are more. I think this has been going on for longer than the last few years." The wind moved through the tall grass along the road shoulder. Down the county route, a truck engine turned over somewhere and faded. Loretta thought about the 3 envelopes, 2019-20, 2020, 21. 3 years of a company in Pittsburgh,
trying to reach a woman whose name was on a piece of land, the letters going out and coming back. Returned to sender while the clock stood still at 9:14. She thought about Cade Finn arriving with coffee that had traveled 45 minutes and a script that had traveled from his father's attorney's office. She thought about Douglas's hand on the door frame and the way his eyes had moved to the new lock and the particular quality of the silence that had followed. She thought about what Evelyn Cross had asked her right before she turned to leave. Your ex-husband, he hasn't been in contact with our office recently, has he? You want to see the papers? She said. Bertie's pen was already moving toward the spiral binding. Come inside, Loretta said. She didn't wait to see if Bertie followed. She walked back up the lane toward the cabin. Behind her, after a moment, she heard the pickup door close. Bertie Sote called at 7 in the morning 4 days later. Loretta was already at the table with a cup of coffee and the legal pad she had been filling in the evenings, everything she could remember in order the way Bertie had told her to write it. Like a route, Bertie had said, just the stops, just the sequence, just what you saw at each address. Outside, the first frost had come in overnight. The grass along the lane stood white at the tips in the early light. The fence her father had built 40 years ago ran along the left side of the property, the posts still straight, the wire still taut. It had held through everything the years had brought. Loretta Bertie said, No preamble. I got the records from Appalachian Basin Energy. Public records request. They came through last night. Loretta set down her coffee.
There's a memorandum of agreement in their files, Bertie said, dated April 2022. It covers a preliminary lease arrangement for the mineral rights at your property on Haynes Ridge Road. The signature on the lessee side reads, Loretta A. Finn. The frost outside. The legal pad. The pen she had set down. That's not my signature, Loretta said. No, Bertie said. It isn't. She explained what she had found. She had pulled Loretta's notarized signature from the 2003 mineral rights transfer, the original in the county. Records the page that Evelyn Cross had read carefully and set down on the chair arm between them. She had placed it next to the signature on the April 2022 memorandum. The name was correct. The handwriting was not. The person who had signed in April 2022 had written the capital L with the stroke going right the standard way, the way most people wrote it, the way it was taught in schools. Loretta's L went left on the first stroke. A small leftward hook before the vertical line came down. The way her father had taught her when she was 8 years old, because that was the way his mother had taught him, and he saw no reason to change a thing that worked. She had written her name that way on every piece of mail, every form, every document for 57 years. It was in the muscle memory of her hand, deeper than habit, closer to instinct. Douglas Finn had known her name. He had not known her hand. There's more, Bertie said. The memorandum was transmitted by email, sent from Douglas Finn's personal account to the Land Acquisition Office at Appalachian Basin Energy in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's in the records. She paused. That's not just forgery, Loretta. That's wire fraud.
federal jurisdiction. Loretta did not say anything for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, a crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the lane, turned its head once in each direction, the way crows did, and flew off. "There's something else," Bertie said. She had gone back into the county filing system. In the 18 months before Loretta had arrived at the clerk's office with her father's papers, 3 separate requests had been submitted to update the contact information on record for the Haynes Ridge Road property to register an active address where correspondence could reach the rights holder. 3 requests, each one sitting in the processing queue, each one marked pending review. All 3 assigned to the same staff member for processing. Loretta knew the answer before Bertie said it. "Evelyn Cross," she said. "3 requests," Bertie said. "Same clerk. All still pending." "You decide what that means." The woman who had sat across from her and told her not to sign anything. The woman who had told her the transfer was clean and the name on it was hers, and nobody could walk past it like it didn't exist. The woman who had asked right at the end whether Douglas had been in contact with the office recently, had been making sure in the way available to her that the right people knew someone was looking, while also making sure in the way available to her that certain information arrived at certain places slowly enough to serve a particular purpose. Loretta sat with that. The coffee had gone cold. She hadn't touched it since Bertie started talking. She got up from the table, not because she had somewhere to go, just because sitting still had stopped working. She walked to the window and looked out at the lane and the frost-tipped grass and the fence her father had built that was still standing. 33 years. She had written Douglas's name on Christmas cards, on school permission slips for Cade, on every get-well card from their church when his mother was ill 2 winters running. She had written Douglas and Loretta so many times over so many years that the letters ran together in the memory of her hand, automatic unthought. He had written her name once. 1 page, April 2022. Sent by email to Pittsburgh like it was a task he was clearing from a list before the end of the quarter. She stood at the window until her hands stopped shaking. It didn't take as long as the first time. "Is this enough?" she asked. "For the story." "It's enough to start," Bertie said. "But I need you to agree to be named. Your full name. Your account of what happened in your words. Without that, I have documents. With that, I have a person. And a person is what makes it impossible to ignore." Loretta looked up at the wall above the door. The hunting vest, the wool jacket, the canvas work cap on its nail, her father's things in the places he had left them. The brim of the cap curved exactly the way it had always been curved, waiting without complaint for however long it took. She thought about what her father had underlined twice on the paper in the wooden box, pressing the pen down hard the second time so the words would hold. "Don't let anybody tell you this is nothing." He hadn't been talking about the land. He had been talking about her. He had always been talking about her. She wasn't going to wait for a newspaper story to do what she could do herself. She had the documents. She had the timeline. She had the 2003 transfer with her name on the designation line, her signature with the leftward L, that Douglas had not known well enough to copy. She had the 3 envelopes stamped "Return to Sender." She had the April 2022 memorandum with the forged signature and Douglas's email address in the transmission records. She had 31 years of knowing exactly how to organize a stack of undeliverable items so that anyone who looked at them could understand the full story in the right order. The federal building in Pikeville was 40 minutes down Route 7. The office of the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Kentucky was on the 3rd floor. She had delivered mail to that building for 6 years before her route changed.
She knew where the parking was. She knew which entrance stayed unlocked until 5. She knew that if you arrived before 10 on a weekday, and you had a clear story and clean documentation and the particular kind of patience that came from decades of doing work that mattered, without anyone asking about it, someone would talk to you. She went back to the table. She gathered the papers, the mineral rights registration, the 2003 transfer, the 3 envelopes, the forged memorandum that Bertie had sent her a copy of by email the previous night. She squared them on the table the way she had always squared a stack of sorted mail. Then she put them in the manila envelope back in the canvas bag and picked up her car keys.
"Is this enough?"
Bertie had asked. It was enough to start. Loretta Haynes was going to be the one who started it. She drove toward Pikeville in the early morning frost, with the canvas bag on the passenger seat and the iron key in her coat pocket, and her father's words written in the particular way they had always been written in her mind, in the hand he had taught her in letters that bent the way he had told her they should bend, and that no one who had not been shown could have known how to copy. The federal building in Pikeville sat on the corner of 2nd Street and Riverview Avenue, a brick and glass structure that looked exactly like what it was, a place where the government conducted its business with the measured certainty of an institution that had been doing so for a very long time and intended to continue. Loretta had delivered mail to this building for 6 years before her route changed. She knew the parking structure on the east side the entrance that stayed unlocked until 5, the security desk on the ground floor where a man named Harold had worked for as long as she could remember, though she didn't know if Harold was still there. He was. He looked up when she came through the door, and there was the small pause of a man trying to place a face he recognized from a context that no longer applied.
"You used to bring the mail," he said.
"I did," she said. 31 years. He nodded, and something in his expression settled into a kind of respect that had nothing to do with what she was carrying in the canvas bag, and everything to do with the 31 years themselves. He checked her identification, issued her a visitor's badge, and told her the 3rd floor. She took the elevator up. The assistant United States attorney who agreed to see her that morning was a woman named Sylvie Drummond, 40-something, with the particular quality of attention that belonged to people who spent their professional lives listening to what was said and what wasn't said in equal measure. She had short dark hair and wore no jewelry except a watch on her left wrist. And she sat across a government-issue table from Loretta and listened without interrupting while Loretta laid the documents out in sequence, oldest to newest, left to right, the way the story ran in the right direction.
The 1989 mineral rights registration. The 2003 transfer notarized her name on the designation line. The 3 envelopes from Appalachian Basin Energy 2019, 2020, 2021, each stamped Return to Sender. The April 2022 memorandum with the forged signature. The email transmission record showing Douglas Fenn's personal account in the sender field. The Appalachian Basin Energy Land Acquisition Office in the recipient field. The date and timestamp that put it 8 months before Douglas had sat down at the kitchen table on Chestnut Drive and told her in his most reasonable voice that he thought it was time they went their separate ways. And the neatly written pages from the legal pad. Everything in order, dates and times, and what was said and what wasn't written, the way she had always written, irregularity reports at the post office. Just the facts, just the sequence, nothing she couldn't verify. Sylvie Drummond looked at the documents for a long time. She asked 3 questions. Loretta answered all 3. Then Sylvie picked up the April 2022 memorandum and looked at the signature line. "You didn't sign this," she said. It was a statement, not a question. "No. How can you demonstrate that Loretta took the legal pad and wrote her name on it? The way she had always written it. The leftward hook on the first stroke of the L, the way her father had shown her when she was 8 years old, because that was how his mother had shown him, and he saw no reason to change a thing that worked." She placed it next to the memorandum on the table. Sylvie looked at both signatures for a moment. Then she looked up. "Is there anyone else who can verify your signature 31 years of postal records?" Loretta said. "Every form I signed at the Harlan post office, every document in my employment file." Sylvie nodded slowly, the nod of a person filing something away, rather than expressing agreement. She picked up the email transmission record. "This was sent from his personal account," Loretta said, "to their office in Pittsburgh. I was told that constitutes wire fraud." Sylvie looked at her. "Who told you that a journalist who works for the Pike County Courier?" She obtained the records through a public records request. Sylvie set the document down and was quiet for a moment, looking at the papers spread across the table in their careful sequence. Outside the window behind her, the Kentucky River moved in its slow October way, the color of iron and patience. "I can't tell you what we will or won't pursue," Sylvie said. "What I can tell you is that you've done exactly the right thing by bringing this here, and that you should leave everything with me. Originals, if you have them. Copies, if you don't." Loretta had brought copies. The originals were at the cabin in the tin box on the shelf above the kitchen sink, where they no longer needed to be hidden from anyone. She left the copies with Sylvie Drummond. She left the federal building at 11:47 in the morning and stood on the sidewalk outside for a moment in the cold October air and felt the particular lightness of a person who has set something down that they have been carrying for longer than they realized. Then she drove back to Haynes Ridge Road. She called Bertie that evening and told her she would be named. Full name, her account in her words. Loretta Ann Haynes, she said, 65 years old, Pike County, Kentucky. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then the sound of a pen clicking open. "Tell me from the beginning," Bertie said. So she did. The article ran on a Thursday. Loretta bought 2 copies from the machine outside the hardware store on Maple Street in Harlan, the same hardware store where she had bought the brass lock for the cabin door 6 weeks earlier. She sat in the car in the parking lot and read it there in the cold, the engine off her breath, making small clouds in the air inside the car. Bertie wrote the way she worked everything else plainly without ornament in the order that made the story clearest to someone encountering it for the first time. The headline was straightforward: mineral rights, missing signatures, and the women who didn't know what they were signing away. 3 cases documented. 2 women identified by county and year only at their own request. 1 woman named in full at her own request. Loretta Ann Haynes, 65, of Pike County, Kentucky. She read her name in the newspaper, the way she had read it on the transfer document 6 weeks ago, in a cold cabin on Haynes Ridge Road, in the thin October light, coming through a dirty window with a young oak pressing against it from the outside. Once for the information. Once to make sure it was real. She folded 1 copy and put it in the glove box. The other she left on the passenger seat flat headline facing up and drove back to the cabin. The calls and messages began that afternoon. Douglas called twice from a number she didn't recognize, which meant he had been careful enough to use a different phone, which told her everything she needed to know about where his head was. She did not answer. Cade sent 3 text messages over the course of the day, each one progressively less warm than the last. The careful veneer of concern wearing thin by the 3rd one, which said only that she was making a serious mistake and that he hoped she understood that. She read all 3 messages once and set the phone face down on the table. That evening, she sat at the pine table with a cup of tea and listened to the wood stove tick and settle and thought about what it meant that they were still trying. As long as they were calling and messaging and arriving at her door with coffee that had traveled 45 minutes, the situation was still in their minds something that could be managed. Something that could be steered back into the territory where their version of the story was the one that mattered. She had spent 33 years living inside their version of the story. She was done with that now. The pressure continued for 11 days. Calls, messages, 2 more visits, 1 from Cade alone, standing on the porch in the cold, looking younger and less certain than she had ever seen him, and 1 from a man she didn't recognize, who introduced himself as a colleague of Garrett Blevins and said he was only there to make sure she had all the information she needed to make an informed decision. She told him she had an attorney and closed the door. Then, on the 12th day, the silence arrived. It arrived the way certain kinds of weather arrived in eastern Kentucky, without announcement between 1 hour and the next, as if the previous condition had simply decided it was finished and had moved on. No final message from Cade. No final call from a number she didn't recognize. Just silence, complete and sudden, the kind that had a specific shape and weight of its own. Loretta knew that shape. She had learned it over 33 years of living with a man who went quiet
when he was regrouping. When Douglas Fenn stopped talking, it meant he had started listening to lawyers instead of to his own certainty. And that was always when things became more serious, not less. She called Ray Colton that morning. Ray Colton worked out of a 2-room office on Main Street in Harlan, in a building that had housed a law practice of one kind or another since 1947. He was 52 years old, with the deliberate manner of a man who had seen enough urgency in his career to understand that clarity was more useful than speed. He had read Bertie's article the morning it ran. He worked property rights cases on contingency, which meant no fee unless there was a recovery. He answered on the second ring.
Loretta sat at the kitchen table with a pen and the legal pad she had been keeping since the first night in the motel. She asked him 3 questions: what the process looked like, how long it typically took, and what she would need to do on her end. He answered all 3 without making her feel foolish for asking them, which was more than she could say. For the 2 attorneys she had spoken to over the course of her 33-year marriage, both of whom she now understood had been speaking to her the way they spoke to her, because they were on Douglas's account and not on hers. She told him she would be in touch. When she hung up, she sat for a moment with the phone in her lap and looked at the canvas work cap on the wall above the door. The brim curved in its particular way, the way that came from 40 years of the same hand and no other. "Okay, Daddy," she said quietly. "I think I understand now what you meant." The call from Evelyn Cross came on a Friday afternoon 2 weeks after the article ran. Loretta was on the porch with a mug of coffee watching a pair of hawks work the air above the field in slow banking circles. She had been watching them for 20 minutes. She had spent a great deal of her life noticing things that other people didn't pause long enough to see, and she saw no reason to stop now. She answered. Evelyn Cross did not offer pleasantries. She said she wanted Loretta to know that the Pike County Clerk's office had initiated an internal administrative review. She said she was calling from her personal phone. She said she wanted Loretta to know that the 3 pending requests to update the contact information for the Haynes Ridge Road property had been processed that morning, and that going forward, all correspondence related to that property would be directed to Loretta's address. Loretta listened. "I made choices," Evelyn said. "I made them believing certain things that turned out to be incomplete pictures of the situation." Loretta looked out over the field where the hawks were still turning. The grass had gone the particular yellow-brown of November, coming in the green of October, entirely replaced, now the season having made its decision and committed to it. "I understand," Loretta said. She meant it. A pause on the other end. "Then I hope things go the way they should for you." Loretta thanked her and ended the call. She sat on the porch for another few minutes after that, watching the hawks. Then she went inside and wrote the call down in the legal pad. Date time, what was said, what wasn't, the way she had written everything else. Bertie called 2 days later. "The administrative review is confirmed," she said. "Evelyn Cross has been placed on paid administrative leave pending the outcome. I wanted you to hear it from me." Loretta was at the table with a bowl of soup she'd made from vegetables she'd bought at the farmer's market in Harlan the previous Saturday, a trip that had taken most of the morning and had been the first time she'd spent that long in town without thinking about whether she had Douglas's permission, which was not a thought she had consciously suppressed during their marriage so much as a thought she had never allowed to form in the first place. She made a note of that, not in the legal pad, just in the part of her mind that was still learning the shape of her own life without another person's decisions arranged around it, like furniture she hadn't chosen. She made the choice that put her where she was, Loretta said. Same as all of us. Bertie was quiet for a moment on the other end. Then I'm working on a follow-up piece. Would you be willing to talk again? Yes, Loretta said. A week later, a letter arrived from Appalachian Basin Energy Company. 3 paragraphs on company letterhead. Formal language considered and careful. The April 2022 Memorandum of Agreement had been suspended pending the outcome of a signature verification investigation initiated by federal authorities. All further communication regarding the mineral rights at the Haynes Ridge Road property would be directed exclusively to the designated rights holder, as established by the 2003 transfer document on file with Pike County. She read that phrase twice. Designated rights holder. She put the letter in the folder she'd been keeping since the first week in the cabin, the one that held everything in order, oldest to newest, left to right. Then Douglas called. Not Cade, not a number she didn't recognize. Douglas himself from his own phone on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of November, when the temperature had dropped into the 20s overnight and the cabin's repaired wood stove was earning its keep. She answered because she had decided she would answer when he called directly, because there were things that needed to be said in the open air between 2 people without lawyers or messages or sons acting as intermediaries, and because she had spent 33 years having conversations on Douglas Finn's terms, and she had decided that this one would be on hers. Douglas, she said. His voice was the voice she had known for 33 years. Controlled, modulated. The voice of a man who had learned a long time ago that the way you said something was often more persuasive than what you said. He told her he had been thinking. He told her he wanted her to understand that everything he had been done to protect what they had built together. He told her that the land, the mineral rights, the property, none of it had ever been about hurting her. It had been about making sure that something valuable wasn't lost in the confusion of a difficult transition. He let the word transition sit there, doing the work it was supposed to do. Loretta listened to all of it. She had learned over 31 years of delivering mail that you let a thing complete itself before you decided what to do with it. You didn't act on the first line of a letter. You read to the end. He finished. The wood stove ticked. The window above the sink showed her the November dark outside, and in the dark, the reflection of the kitchen, the table, the lamp, the shelves, her own face looking back at her with an expression she was still getting used to. Douglas, she said, you packed my father's box into my suitcase because you thought it wasn't worth anything. You held it in your hands and decided it was nothing.
and put it in with my winter nightgown and my heart medication, and you never once thought to ask what was inside. A silence on his end. The particular silence of a man who had prepared for many possible responses and had not prepared for this one.
"You were wrong about that," she said.
"You were wrong about the box, and you were wrong about the land, and you were wrong about what you would find if you ever actually looked at what I was made of. That's been true for longer than either of us probably wants to admit." She could hear him breathing. She did not wait for him to respond. "I have an attorney," she said. "His name is Ray Colton. If you have anything further to say, you can say it to him." She ended the call.
She set the phone on the table and sat very still for a moment, both hands flat on the wood. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the November trees, the last of the leaves coming down in the dark, letting go of the branches they'd held since spring. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that. She sat with it for a moment and let herself notice it fully, the way she had learned to let herself notice things that mattered. Then she got up and put the kettle on. The Monday before Christmas, Loretta went out to the mailbox at 8 in the morning. Old habit, new address. The lane was frozen at the edges, the grass along the fence rails white with frost, the kind of cold that had decided it was staying and had arranged itself accordingly. Her breath came out in small clouds, each one complete and brief and gone. The fence her father had built 40 years ago ran along the left side of the lane, post to post still straight, still holding each post set deep enough to survive what had come down from the hills over the decades. She ran her hand along the top rail as she walked the way she had done as a child, feeling the cold metal under her palm. Inside the mailbox was a single envelope. Return address, Appalachian Basin Energy Company, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She stood at the end of the lane and opened it there in the cold, the way she had always opened things that needed to be faced, rather than carried back inside first. The way her father had opened his mail at the box, standing up, reading it straight through before he did anything else. He had told her once that mail was just information, and information was better met head-on than allowed to sit in a drawer and become something larger than it was. Inside the envelope was a check. She looked at the amount. It was not large. A first payment under the preliminary lease arrangement, modest by any commercial measure, a fraction of what the full agreement would represent over its term, and a fraction again of what the rights themselves were worth when the full picture of what lay beneath Haynes Ridge Road was properly assessed. It would not fix the rest of the roof. It would not undo what Douglas had attempted or erase the years she had spent inside a marriage where a woman thought twice about a can of soup. But it was real, and it was dated, and on the line that read, "Pay to the order," of in clean black type that had been generated by a computer system in an office building in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on the basis of a legal document filed in Pike County in 2003 by a man named Walter Haynes, who had pressed a pen hard into paper so the words would hold Loretta Ann Haynes. Not wife of, not Mrs. Douglas Fenn, not a name that required another name beside it to stand upright. Loretta Ann Haynes. She read it once, then again, then a third time, standing in the December wind at the end of the lane on Haynes Ridge Road, with the frost on the fence rails and the bare trees beyond the clearing and the cabin behind her, with its new lock and its repaired roof and its window that held the weather out. Her breath making small clouds in the cold air, not one person in Harlan County watching. She folded the check into the front pocket of her coat and walked back up the lane. At the bank in Harlan, the teller was a young woman named Deja 20-something, with braided hair and the efficient warmth of someone who was good at her job and knew it without needing to make a point of it. She processed the deposit without comment and then asked if Loretta would like to open a savings account to go along with the new checking account. Loretta had opened the checking account the week after she arrived at the cabin. She had opened it in her name. Her name only on all the documents in the signature line in the leftward L that Douglas had not known well enough to copy. "Let me think on it," she told Deja. Deja nodded and printed the deposit receipt and slid it across the counter with both hands, the way you handed something to a person when you wanted to make sure they received it properly. Loretta drove back to Haynes Ridge Road with the receipt in her coat pocket next to where the check had been. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the receipt lying flat in front of her. The wood stove was going steadily now, reliably, the way it had been going every evening since she'd had the chimney swept in November, the way it would go all winter if she kept feeding it, which she intended to do. The new window above the sink held the December dark outside and gave back the light inside a clean, even reflection she was still adjusting to, still finding herself surprised by when she looked up from the table at the wrong angle. On the shelf above the sink, the tin box sat where she had placed it after bringing everything up from the floorboard the first week. Not hidden anymore, not waiting, just there the way things were when they no longer needed protecting from anyone. The iron key was on the windowsill above the sink where the morning light found it first. She had put it there the second week, not as a symbol, not because she was thinking about what it represented, just because it was a good place for it, and because the morning light on iron was a thing she had come to like. On the shelf above the kitchen doorway, 3 small jars held dried herbs from a plant she'd bought at the farmer's market in Harlan in October, not entirely sure what they were, and not entirely sure they would survive the winter, and deciding to try anyway, because trying was something she had a great deal more room for now than she used to. She did the work in pieces, one weekend at a time, one problem identified and addressed, then the next. The roof patch in November, half of it herself, and half of it a man from Pikeville she'd found through a recommendation from the woman who ran the hardware store. The chimney sweep, the window replacement, a thorough cleaning that had taken 3 full days and had uncovered behind the kitchen baseboards a photograph she hadn't expected her father and mother young, standing in front of the cabin in what must have been the early years, her mother's hand on her father's arm.
both of them squinting into the sun with the particular expression of people who are happy and know it and are not trying to perform it for anyone.
She had put the photograph on the shelf beside the tin box. Now she looked up from the deposit receipt and looked at the wall above the door. The hunting vest, the wool jacket, the canvas work cap on its nail, the brim curved exactly as it had always been curved, in exactly the way that 40 years of the same hand had made it curve, patient and specific and belonging to no one else.
She had looked at that cap every day for 2 months. She had left it exactly where it was on its nail, the way her father had left it. It had felt important to leave it there. It had felt like something that needed to be honored before it could be touched. She got up from the table. She walked across the kitchen to the wall beside the door, and she stood there for a moment, looking at the cap, the way she had looked at it every day, the faded blue of it, the worn fabric at the brim's edge, the sweat-darkened band inside that had taken the shape of the head it had held for 40 years of falls and winters and long mornings in the cold. Then she reached up and took it down. It was lighter than she expected. Things that had been in a place a long time sometimes felt, when you finally touched them, like they should weigh more than they did. Like the time itself should have added to them. But the cap was just a cap canvas and thread, and a wire brim stay light in her hands, smelling faintly of cedar, and something else she couldn't name, but recognized in the same way she had recognized the smell of the cabin when she first opened the door. The smell of her father's life, held in the fibers of a thing he had touched 10,000 times. She put it on. She stood in the kitchen of the cabin on Haynes Ridge Road in Pike County, Kentucky, in the December quiet, with her father's cap on her head and the wood stove going, and the receipt from the bank on the table, and the iron key on the windowsill where the morning light would find it first. And she did not say anything, and no one was watching, and she did not need anyone to be. She stood there for a long moment. Then she took the cap off carefully and hung it back on its nail in the same place, in the same way, the brim, forward, the way it had always been. She went back to the table and finished her tea. When she got up to go to bed, she crossed the kitchen to the light switch beside the door, and her hand went to it and stayed there for a moment. Then she left the light on, not because she had forgotten, not because she was coming back for something, because the cabin had been dark for 12 years, and there was wood in the stove and food in the kitchen, and a lock on the door that only she had the key to. And one winter of light seemed like the least she could offer to a place that had been waiting for her, without complaint, for longer than she had known how to look. She walked down the short hallway to the bedroom. The window above the bed showed her the December sky, a deep clear black. The stars, sharp and plentiful, in the way they were only in places far from city light. The way they had been sharp above this ridge every winter of her father's life, and every winter of the years between. She lay down in the quiet and looked at the ceiling and thought about the deposit receipt on the table and Ray Colton's number in her phone
and Bertie Sull's second article still in progress, and the 3 jars of herbs on the shelf that might survive the winter if she tended them right. She thought about her father pressing the pen down twice on the paper so the words would hold. "Don't let anybody tell you this is nothing," he had known. Somehow, in the way that certain people knew things they had no reason to know, except that they had been paying close attention for a long time. He had known that she would need it. Not the land, not the mineral rights, not the check with her name on the designated line. He had known she would need the reminder. The underlined, double-pressed cedar box kept reminder that the things she was made of were worth more than whatever a man decided to call them. She had delivered other people's mail for 31 years. She had read the shape of 10,000 envelopes without ever reading the contents. And in the end, the most important letter she would ever receive had been sitting in a box on her father's workbench shelf, waiting for the morning when she would finally need to reach up and take it down. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees on Haynes Ridge Road, moving through them the way it had always moved through them without asking permission, without announcing itself, simply present in the way that wind in the mountains was always present, carrying whatever the season asked it to carry, patient and indifferent and entirely uninterested in the particular stories of the people who lived beneath it. But Loretta Haynes was not beneath it tonight. She was inside with the light on in the kitchen and the stove warm in the wall and her name on a check in the bank and her father's cap on its nail by the door. That was enough for tonight. Tomorrow there would be more to do. There was always more to do, and now, for the first time in 33 years, she was the one who would decide what it was.